Good evening, afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I am so pleased to welcome you to this evening's event, Women in Art, Polish Jewish Women Who Fought the Nazis. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more and buy tickets on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So today we are so honored to be joined by Paula Blumenfeld and Dr. Irit Felsen. Paula lives and paints in the greater New York City area. She's fascinated by color and by the human body. Whether abstract or figurative, her paintings begin with the figure or its elements. She paints intimate figurative portraits, capturing the emotional state and inner strength of the subject. In addition, she creates abstract paintings, which allow her to exclusively focus on composition and color. You can learn more about her at her website, which is also posted in the chat. Irit is a clinical psychologist specializing in the effects of trauma and traumatic loss and the intergenerational transmission of both trauma and resiliencies in families of Holocaust survivors. She's an adjunct professor at Columbia University and at Yeshiva University in New York City, co-chair of the Trauma Working Group in the NGO on Mental Health in the United Nations, and chair of the Older Adults Work Group in the Interdivision APA COVID-19 Task Force. She maintains a private practice in Englewood, New Jersey, and her research papers and book chapters have been published in peer-reviewed publications. In addition, her art has been featured in art exhibitions in Hamburg, London, and New Jersey. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Paula and Irit.
Thank you so much, Sydney. So we are really honored to be here, and I'm particularly honored to be here in conversation with Paula and with, I see your beautiful art behind you, Paula, which is really a special pleasure. And I want to start with the question about your family. I know that we talked, you shared with me that your father was a survivor. Could you tell us a little bit about how his Holocaust experiences shaped you or influenced you?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank both of you for the lovely, warm introductions. And I'm so happy and appreciative to be able to share both my paintings and the stories of these amazing women with everyone. So my father was born in a small town in southern Poland called Opt, or in Polish, Opatów. He was the youngest of 10 siblings. At the time of World War II, he was the only one who wasn't married with a family. And I'm going to backtrack a second. His father moved the family to Łódź around the time of my father's bar mitzvah. And when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, the Jews in my father's neighborhood were identified by their non-Jewish neighbors, so the Nazis knew who to take. From there, he was sent to the Łódź ghetto, afterwards Hassag, which was a labor camp where they made munitions for the Germans in Częstochowa, and from there to 3 concentration camps, the last of which I believe was Dora. And as a survivor at that time, he was on the forced marches with other survivors across Germany to the Baltic Sea, to Lübeck. When he got there, there were about 5,000 of, I believe, the 80,000 or so survivors who survived the walk. And they were loaded onto a ship, which was a former luxury liner, which took German wealthy people to South America in the winter. By this time, it was in a state of terrible disrepair, and it was actually a floating concentration camp. The 5,000 survivors were loaded onto this ship, and the Germans knew that they had lost the war by this time. Hitler had committed suicide. The British were flying over the ship and dropping leaflets to surrender. Instead of surrendering, the ship opened fire on the airplanes, and the ship was immediately bombed by the British. It went up in flames. My father, who did not know how to swim, grabbed a piece of wood, jumped into the freezing Baltic Sea, and woke up at some time. He doesn't know who rescued him or how, but he woke up in a German hospital in Lübeck with 2 German nurses having a conversation over him, trying to figure out what he was, because to them, he didn't look Jewish, but he was circumcised. So that's my father's story. How he influenced me over the years was in his morality, his resilience, his teaching me when I got older about the Holocaust, what he saw and what he experienced. I think I gleaned the most of his experiences during his last 5 years when he lived with my family here. My son was still in high school, and he shared a lot of his experiences with my son at that time.
Yes, like many grandparents, that dialogue was a little easier and flowed a little better sometimes in those later years with grandchildren. Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me, in this community in which you grew up, you mentioned to me that there were a lot of Holocaust survivors. And what was the narrative about survival, about resistance, about all of that that you grew up with? What was the prevailing narrative about that?
I think there was not a lot of talk about it among the survivors. There seemed to me in retrospect, I didn't understand this as a child, but there was a sense of shame at perhaps not being able to prevent the Holocaust, at having survived. There was a lot of guilt about that as well. And there was also a feeling of, I grew up in a working class blue collar neighborhood filled with immigrants from Eastern Europe and Germany. And a lot of their anti-Semitism was expressed at us. There were some bullies in the neighborhood, and I felt threatened. And my father said, I can't fight your battles for you, but I can teach you how to fight. He hung up a punching bag for me in our basement, taught me how to punch, and I was tasked with taking care of myself and protecting my little brother, which
Which you did.
I did. Yes.
Good for you. And then you came across the book by Judy Batalion, yes, The Light of Days, in which she described these lesser known heroes, these women that you chose to paint. Can you tell us a little bit about what did that reveal to you about the Holocaust or about this narrative when you read that book?
Well, it was a revelation. It was compelling and awesome and very, very difficult to read. I had not known about any of these Polish Jewish women who fought the Nazis, and I was overwhelmed by their acts of courage, resistance, bravery, their need to save the Jewish people, putting aside all of their backgrounds. They were very young. Some of them, like Renia Kukielka, were as young as 16. Others, most of them, I think, were in their 20s. Some of them were a little bit older, but they defied all stereotypes, cultural stereotypes of what women were able to do, as well as Jewish kind of rules or traditions about what women were supposed to do. Some of them came from Hasidic backgrounds, and I'm thinking right now of Nutta Teitelbaum, who we'll look at later on in the program. She initially left her Hasidic background, joined the Polish Communist Party before she joined the Jewish resistance groups, and she was an assassin, not something a nice Jewish girl typically does. They joined resistance groups. They were called kashariot, or a kasharit is a singular, which means in Hebrew a connector. They connected the various Jewish communities with news, with false papers. They forged all kinds of ID documents to help Jews escape the ghettos. They were assassins. They built and threw bombs. They bombed train tracks. They transported munitions. They flirted and were able to do things that men were unable to do because they were women. They were never asked to drop their pants, which could identify a Jewish man in an instant. If they didn't look stereotypically Jewish and were able to speak strong colloquial Polish, which most of these women did in addition to speaking other foreign languages, they passed. They smuggled. They brought children to safety in Polish homes. Of course, they had to bring money also to help pay for the expenses of keeping the children. They smuggled people in and out of the ghettos with false papers that they had forged. And you'll see in the paintings we look at later how I've symbolized their deeds of courage and resistance and resilience.
So a very, very different story, a bunch of stories than the terrible expression that that was used in the early years about Jews going like lambs to the slaughter. Very, very different stories.
They definitely did not go like lambs. They fought all the way, every bit of the way. Their courage and fight, both literally and figuratively, should be an inspiration to every woman. They certainly inspired me.
Well, that is clear as you speak about them. I think it shows so powerfully in your face and in your eyes. And that would have been my next question to you. You know, you put so much time into creating this remarkable series of paintings. What was it? Was this inspiration that you wanted to capture?
I wanted to capture all of those qualities in these paintings, their resilience, their courage, their heroism, and their devotion to the Jewish people. They put their lives at risk on a regular basis to save other people. And in doing this, I had to do a lot of research to create the paintings. The book, The Light of Days, presented a number of black and white photos. So the only photos from this time of the Nazi occupation of Poland, the only photos that were available were relatively poor quality black and whites. There were many photos that of the women who were described in the book where there was no photo. And I had to do a fair amount of archival research online, whether they were Polish women archives, Jewish women's archives, Yad Vashem archives. There was a fair amount of material available. And I decided to paint 18 of these women based on a number of factors. The first being the number of black and white photos that were available to me. I didn't feel that I wanted to just make up faces. I wanted some reality there. The other thing, I needed to depict symbols of their heroism that was unique to each woman in the painting. So I zeroed in on 18, which is in Hebrew the word chai, which means life. And these paintings allowed me to bring these 18 women back to life so we can celebrate them, especially now that it's Women's History Month.
Right. So there was a huge element of a research challenge involved, and also this aesthetic challenge of how to translate these pictures into colorful images.
You're
Yes.
correct. So there was an additional artistic challenge, which was partially getting the painting to look like the photograph in as much as I could see the quality of the photograph, and then to create a composition and color that worked and supported the woman's life and deeds.
And I think, as we will see, at least in some of them that we'll have the opportunity to look at with you, it looks like you really succeeded beyond belief in doing that. They're gorgeous. So due to the time constraints that we have, we may not, of course, be able to look at all 18 paintings, but would you like to maybe look at the few of them, maybe 3, or we'll see how time allows, because we would like to leave enough room for some Q&A at the end. Would you like to look at a few of them and tell us about each of them, about the women, about the process of how you chose them, this particular one, and anything that you can tell us about the process and the story?
I will be happy to do that.
Thank you, Sydney.
Okay. So this painting is Vladka Mead. Her real name was Fagel Peltel, but when she went underground as a Katsarit in Poland, particularly in the Warsaw Ghetto, she took the name Vladka. She spoke flawless colloquial Polish, and she smuggled arms, she smuggled children out of the ghetto, she smuggled IDs for people in the ghetto to get out. You can see a reference to forged papers on her, as you look at the painting, on the right side of the painting, on her green jacket. And if you look up at the top left, you will see orange and green stripes. I use those stripes to represent the in and out of the ghetto, because she was regularly moving in and out. And I've hidden her name, Vladka, in those orange and green stripes, because she had to remain hidden to do the work she did. She also smuggled bombs and munitions. And if you look at the background, both in the peach and on the red ground, on the left side of the painting, you will see shapes that resemble bombs. That was one of the things she was noted for in her smuggling. She also smuggled metal files, which she hoped would help Jewish people who were loaded on trains to the concentration camps to cut through the metal bars of the trains. I don't know how effective that was, but she ultimately survived. She came to the United States with her husband, Benjamin Mead, and she became one of the foremost speakers about the Holocaust in this country. I think she died in 2012 at the age of 91.
Wow.
And she also wrote a book which was called, just looking for that. I'm sorry, I can't find what her book was called, but she did write a book about her life and her deeds of courage.
Wow. And what was her name once she lived in?
Vladka Mead.
And
she was,
that's the name she wrote the book under?
yes, once she came to the United States, that became her permanent name.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Where did she live in the States?
She lived in New York and she died in Arizona. In fact, her son is a physician. He's still in New York.
Wow. Amazing story. Thank you.
Yes.
Sydney, can you move us to the next painting, please?
Okay, this is Jutta Teitelbaum, who was also known as Little Wanda with the braids in Polish. She was from a Hasidic family, and she joined the Communist Party initially before she got involved with the Jewish resistance. She was another blonde, blue-eyed beauty, and she was dubbed by the Jewish communities heroine of the Holocaust, of Warsaw, because she worked in the Warsaw Ghetto. And you can see at the bottom in red lettering, I've written heroine of Warsaw. At the top, I've written in red as well, Little Wanda with the braids. That was her Polish name. If you look to the lower right of the painting, you will see a group of symbols, which are the symbol of the assassin. She was really gutsy. She walked into Nazi headquarters with a loaded revolver with a silencer. She intimated to the guards at the headquarters that she was possibly pregnant by the Nazi she was going to visit. And she walked into this Nazi's office and with a silencer on her gun, shot the Nazi in the head and walked out, totally unsuspecting by any of the Nazis. And she also assassinated 2 other Nazis in Nazi headquarters. There was another one she shot, but he didn't die. And so to finish her job, she dressed up as a doctor and went to the hospital where he was being cared for and shot him dead there. If you look to the bottom of the painting, you will see drips in orange and red on the green ground. This is a technique or device I developed to differentiate between the women who survived and those who didn't. So on some level, the painting is not complete. I didn't finish the bottom. I mean, the painting is complete, but I left the drips and some level of incompletion in her braids because she did not survive. She was arrested by the Nazis, tortured for weeks, and ultimately succumbed to her torture. But she was an incredible, incredible ballsy woman. And I think particularly coming from the kind of background, a Hasidic background, to, I don't want to say abandon her religious background, but to leave it behind and do what needed to be done as an incredibly brave woman warrior.
Incredible, incredible story, really. Yeah.
This is Bella Hazan. Bella went by the name Brania in her Polish identity. You can see her name Bronia on her sleeve on the right bottom of the screen. All of these Katsariot who were out and about and moving in non-Jewish Poland had to dress very fashionably in order not to be singled out as Jews or anything else. So I looked at a lot of archives about fashion in Poland in the 1940s, and I took a dress style that was considered very fashionable at the time, but I colored and striped it as a precursor to her incarceration in Auschwitz, in the Auschwitz uniform. So while it's a fashionable dress, it's patterned after an Auschwitz uniform. And if you look behind her shoulder on the left, you'll see some flames that also hint at Auschwitz. Another hint of Auschwitz on the right above the blue band is a hint at barbed wire. So there's a figure looming in the background on the left. That is taken from German photos of Bela when she was apprehended by the Nazis. And when they were incarcerated in Auschwitz, they were given a number, which I have put on her scalp. That was her Katzetnik, or concentration camp prisoner number. And she's in a concentration camp uniform to indicate that she was a prisoner at Auschwitz. There's also a very weak line at the top of the painting, which hints at the barbed wire in Auschwitz. She wrote a book also, and I believe her son wrote a book about her experiences as well some years ago. She died around 2012 in Israel also. There were only 2 of the surviving women. 11 out of the 18 survived, and only 2 did not go to Israel.
And those were Vladka and who else?
Vladka and Faye Schulman. Faye went to Canada, I believe, and she just died a couple of years ago at 102. She was, I didn't send her the painting of her, but she was a professional photographer who documented the Nazi atrocities while she was a partisan with the Russians. And when you look at her painting, you'll see how she is depicted with a collar that's covered with little cameras, because that was her profession. And in the background is a pattern consisting of rifles, because there are photos of her when she was with the Russian partisans holding a rifle.
And you said she was a photographer and her photographs survived?
Her photographs survived. She went on to be a professional photographer, and she always refuted any claims that the Holocaust did not happen. And her response was, I have the photos to prove it did happen.
That's amazing. Perhaps we will have the good enough time to actually get to her painting as well.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Would you like to move on to the next one?
Yes, let's look at Bronka Klibanski. Beautiful Bronka. So her name was Bronka, but because she was a kasharit and had to go about her deeds in hiding, I hid her name. It is on the diagonal in the upper left, and it's backwards. Now, Bronka, like other kashariot, was extremely flirtatious. And this was one of the many advantages that women resistors of the Nazis had over men. They could flirt, they could use their beauty to their advantage, they could make friends with Nazis. In fact, there is a picture in the book Light of Days of 3 of these Jewish women, one of them Bella Hazan, who we just looked at a Nazi Christmas party. So they really got away with a lot of mischief. They did a lot of damage, and they were quite remarkable. So Bronka was a thespian. She loved to act. And I used symbols of thespians or theater in the ground. And if you look at the lower left, you will see the smiling and frowning faces. They are also scattered through the background in the gray and peachy areas, and also in the purple. She was also involved in the Dror, or Freedom Jewish Resistance Movement. And so I've got that in the purple ground. And then if you look closely, on the left side above the light grayish lavender area, you will see the letters RX. She was particularly a smuggler of medicines, so I wanted to allude to that. And across the bodice of her dress, she also has a decoration, which is a thespian design. And her braids and beautiful face depict a very innocent young woman, but she was capable of amazing resistance. She even smuggled a gun and a loaf of bread. And when she was accosted by a Nazi and asked what was in her bag, she admitted to smuggling the loaf of bread without ever mentioning that the bread contained arms. So she was
Remarkable.
quite an actor. I would like to add something. A couple of years ago, when I was at Yad Vashem, there was a video of her in her probably 70s speaking about her experience. And I knew who it was immediately. She was still as beautiful and recognizable as in her paintings. And I'd also like to mention that she was able to bring invaluable archives from Poland to Israel, which are now housed at Yad Vashem.
Remarkable.
Yes.
Archives of what, Paula?
Archives, they're called the Marsic Tenenbaum archives, which are a record of life and resistance in the Bialystok ghetto. She was from Bialystok, which is also written across the center right top of the painting, if you look carefully.
What are the sizes of the paintings, by the way?
All of the paintings are 24 inches high by 20 inches wide. I wanted to make them large enough to depict the women very clearly and have a consistent size so they would read as a group when exhibited.
You know, it's interesting that that's the size that you chose, because when I speak to directors of nursing homes and long-term care facilities and other places like that, I recommend that when the patients are in very, very deteriorated stage and cannot be really interacted with, or are very far from, you know, the way that we usually see others who are as human as us, as somebody called it in her paper, to put photographs of these people that are about at least a quarter of a big page, or a half a page, which is the size similar to what you chose, to hang photographs like that of them on the wall above their beds, is something that I always recommend, because it is the size almost of the way that we see people in real life. And so it's not too small, it's not too big, it makes them very real. And it's also very helpful to include, you know, them in some kind of movement or some kind of a way that depicts what they were doing, which is also very much part of how you're describing these women and the symbols that you embedded in the pictures. It's very interesting. You really sort of instinctively chose the size that makes them the most alive to us.
Thank you. And I appreciate your giving me some psychological background to the size, because it didn't occur to me. It just seemed to be a very reasonable, viewable, approachable size to me. And of course, I wanted consistency so they could be exhibited as a group.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. So maybe we can look at one or two more, and then I have another sort of question to you, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Of course. Okay. This is Heike Klinger, who was from a very Orthodox Hasidic background in Bedzin, Poland. And I hope I portrayed her overwhelming sadness in her eyes. So she abandoned her Hasidic background and saw herself as a revolutionary. One of the symbols for revolutionary is the clenched fist, which I put on her tie or scarf. And I contrasted the revolutionary fervor with the very delicate design I did on the shirt and the scalloped edges at the top of the painting. At the very top of the painting, you will see the words, which I'm having difficulty reading. on my screen, but what it says is, I'm sorry, can you read it? I can't read
Are
it from
do you mean the words
at the
on the
very
book?
top in the yellow.
At the very top in the yellow? Let me see if I can read it.
I cannot.
It says, so, something to
I can,
live,
that helps. I think it's a sentence to live.
sentence to live, yes.
Sentence to live. Thank you. I forgot what I wrote there. So sentence to live was something she wrote about in her book, which is on the right side of the painting. It was called Miyoman HaGhetto, a diary of the ghetto, where she documented what she went through. And she wrote in this book, I was sentenced to live. She went to a kibbutz in Israel after surviving the war and had 3 children, but she was overwhelmed with guilt at having survived and depression. And she ultimately committed suicide. She had the resilience to fight during the time of the Nazis and to save many people and to be a revolutionary. But when it came to living, she was unable to continue. It was very sad. Very,
It,
very sad.
it's incredibly sad, but not at all an incredibly rare phenomenon. As we know, some of the very famous survivors committed suicide, and many survivors, many other survivors, express similar feelings, at least at times, in my conversations with them.
Yeah, I think there may have been, for many people, it was really hard to kind of live a normal life with what they had experienced and that sense of shame and guilt at not having done enough, at having survived. It was overwhelming. And I tried to depict her depression through her expression and also alluding to the blue in the background as the blue in her state of psychological being.
Yes, yes, I think that we know that for many people this was a very, very heavy burden. And if you ever have a chance to watch, but actually I think it's in Hebrew, but then you speak Hebrew, and maybe some of the people who are with us this evening have had a chance to watch the documentary called The 81st Blow, which is one of the Israeli documentaries in which a survivor speaks very poignantly about the fact that as long as the children were growing up, he and his wife were managing to hide this sadness and this burden. And then once the children were grown, it was very hard to live with the feelings that they had. And at the same time, there are a lot of survivors, and maybe your father, from what I sort of gathered from you, was one of them, who lived with great appreciation of life and of the good things in their lives, just because so much was lost and everything that they had was so precious.
Yes, he was able to be much more appreciative and positive when we were growing up, despite his having nightmares, which I heard all through my childhood, his screaming in his sleep. At the same time, as he aged, he became much more focused on what he had endured. And it was very difficult and very painful to listen to him, but these were his experiences. And he lived to the age of 93, despite many, many medical problems that were caused by the Holocaust. But he managed to speak about it. He lived in Rochester, New York, where I grew up, and he was a very prominent speaker for the Holocaust and Genocide Center at Monroe Community College there. He lectured hundreds of times after he retired to high school and college students. And I was told by the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Center that he was their #1 speaker. He was a super speaker. He really was.
Amazing. So both of you found a very unique way, each of you, to really put it out there and speak for the
Yeah.
survivors and for those who didn't survive.
My father always had a need, which I admire, and that was beyond surviving to bear witness to the
Right.
atrocities, because it's so unbelievable that it could have happened. Just
Yeah.
like October 7th was unbelievable, but we won't get into that now.
Yes.
But he always taught in his positive mode that there were immense dangers to blind hatred and to prejudice. So those were lessons I grew up with.
So speaking of lessons, these women, these incredible, courageous women, how do you feel that you personally try to continue or emulate in any way the lessons or the inspiration that you got from them, and how can any of us try to do the same?
Wow, that's quite a question. I think all of these women need to be seen and recognized by all of us, especially women, as embodying the power of what we're able to do. They defied every stereotype of women, of culture, of religious women, and they did what they had to do. And they were able to do it better than men in so many cases because they were women, because they could flirt, because they were more adept at spying and persuading and better conversationalist. So there are a number of lessons I take. I think it's really important to stand up for whatever cause is important to you. Right now, speaking out against anti-Semitism, which has reared its ugly face, is exceedingly important at this time. We can all do that. We can engage with people who don't know better and try to help them understand what's really happening in Israel. We can join organizations and work for them when they fight anti-Semitism. And we can speak out for all the people who haven't had this opportunity, for these women who did not survive, for the women who did, and remind people the courage and resilience it took to do the acts they did and how they were dedicated to putting their lives on the line for the betterment of other people.
Paula, this was really an incredible opportunity to speak with you about these women. And I'm sure there will be some questions that people would like to ask you and to hear your input. So I'll open it up at this time for the Q&A. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you.
amazing.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for that really interesting and insightful conversation before we move into audience questions. And so I do want to start by asking, I'm just going to ask a question of my own while we wait for a few more audience questions to come in. And as I do that, feel free to put more questions in the chat. But Paula, I'm wondering how long it took you to do the entire set of paintings.
It was over 2 years. I did a lot of archival research initially, and then there was a lot of thought involved. I worked typically on 2 paintings at a time, which is my shtick. If I get stuck on one, I move to the other. So there
You
was
and
kind of
Picasso.
pardon me?
You and Picasso.
Yeah, I didn't know that about Picasso. Thank you. So I've always got more than one canvas going at a time. And these paintings allowed me to work in oil with a little bit of mixed media when it was necessary. My paintings are typically oil, mixed media, and watercolor. And I just continued to work until I felt I had exhausted 18 portraits, and I was able to bring these 18 women back to life.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for that. So, you know, you talked about how you learned about these women first from The Light of Days from Judy Batalion's book. But was there anything sort of specifically that piqued your interest while reading the book or made you say like, oh, this can be art as well?
Wow, I found the book really painful to read. I did not just sit down and read it in one fell swoop over the course of a week. It's a very dense book. It took me a good 2 months to get through it. And I found the women very compelling and learned more about them that was not in the story of how they interacted within the ghettos more individually, both before they started their work as connectors and then after, about their lives in Israel or the States through my research.
May I ask you, by the way, did you share the paintings with Judy Batalion?
I did. And Judy was wonderful. She posted, I don't know how many of them, but she posted them on her website. And she came to some talks I was giving in Westchester. And then we had a conversation together about her book and my paintings at Federation in New York City. So she's been wonderful.
Great, good to hear.
Thank you.
Do we have any comments or questions from the audience in the few minutes that we still have?
Yeah, I've moved into some audience questions, but just to say in terms of comments, we have a lot of people who are saying that you really captured these women's spirit and that they're so grateful that we are sharing this with them. So, but we want to thank you all for joining us as well. But Paula, since you know, it seems like you really know these women's stories. So we have a question saying that you mentioned that one of the women was captured and killed. I apologize, I don't recall her name. But were any of the other women captured while doing resistance work?
Yes, they were. Absolutely. There was another woman in the Warsaw Ghetto named Tosia Altman, who was very young. She was in her early 20s, and she did a tremendous amount of fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And she went, as many of them did when they were in the bunkers, they went in and out of the sewers. And in the painting I did of her, I have a ladder at the top of the painting, and coming down, I believe it's on the right side on a diagonal, if I remember correctly. She was also blonde and fair and able to pass. And she used a ladder to get in and out of the sewers. And her last mission, she was severely burned by the Germans who set the bunker afire, and they ultimately captured her and tortured her to death.
Yeah. Ugh, that's
That's just one instance, but 7 of the 18 women did not survive.
So of those who did survive the war, did you ever have the opportunity to meet any of them in person or and in any other way, I suppose?
No, I actually was totally unaware of these heroines of the Holocaust prior to reading the book, as probably most of us were. I did have the wonderful opportunity, it was in the 1980s, of going to the first international gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors with my parents in Philadelphia. And both Vladka and her husband, Benjamin Mead, were featured speakers. I'm sure they arranged for that conference, but knowing as little as I did about them at the time, it didn't register with me. I remember their names, but I did not know much more. And Vladka at that time did not talk about her acts of heroism at all.
That's a very, very
Very
interesting.
modest.
It's very interesting also, as we touched upon when we spoke, when you and I met. It's very interesting how little is known about the extent of the resistance actions in different camps in general, and in particular about women in the Holocaust. It's really only in recent years that some researchers have begun to focus on the gendered Holocaust and the differences and all of that, which is really an interesting observation, right?
And an important one. It's very important.
And a very important one. And, also, first of all, because right now we're focusing on these really remarkable heroines and the terrible fate that some of them found, but also there is, of course, the knowledge that women in war are oftentimes particularly vulnerable to all kinds of atrocities, as you mentioned, just like we saw very recently. And that whole aspect was really only recently touched upon, I think, because it's so particularly vulnerable. And people did not want to talk about it. Those who survived didn't want to talk about it. Those who knew about it didn't really want to talk about it. Just like the pictures of what happened on October 7th were not plastered by Israel on the media out of respect and how delicate this whole aspect is.
Yes, and I'm sure that the people who survived did not talk about many things they endured for issues of pain and shame, both.
Yeah. Yes, of course. There was a very amazing 95-year-old Australian man survivor who talked. I think he had a TED Talk, if I recall, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. And he was telling about a particular day in which he was very badly treated by Nazi soldiers. And at some point he said, and what then they did to me, I will not tell you because I'm too ashamed. And that's, of course, yeah. Sydney, do we have any other comments or questions that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I think we have a couple that we can end on before the end of our time. We have a lot of people, and I'm going to combine these into kind of one question, who are asking, will there be more exhibitions of these paintings? Where can people see them? How can they see more?
Great question. So we've posted my website, which has all of these women and a text describing a bit about each woman's life and her acts of heroism. Please take a look at my website. And for anyone who has any museum contacts, I would love to have another exhibition. Any kind of museum you have a connection to will be most appreciated. Sydney has also posted a couple of videos which describe, one of them is an interview with me, another interview with me about these paintings, as well as me describing each of the paintings individually. And my website is up there, my email. If you think of any additional questions, I will be happy to respond.
May I add one last question, perhaps?
Yeah.
What is it like to become so intensely involved? What was it like for you to become so intensely involved in each of these women's lives and stories and personality?
That's a wonderful question, Irit. I was overwhelmed by the process. I worked around the clock for over 2 years on these amazing women. And I had always wondered, once I was familiar with my father's stories, what I would have done. In fact, I did some other paintings, which are figurative about the Holocaust, in which I put myself in kind of a fading in and out, invisible kind of personage. So I frequently wonder, particularly after reading the book, what I would have done. Obviously, there's no way of knowing, but I would like very much to think that I would have joined the Kashariot in resistance. I would have passed. I'm told I don't look Jewish, whatever that means. And I'd really like to honor these women in every way possible. And I don't want to say count myself among them, but imagine myself as any one of them.
Yes, I think it's very interesting that many of us, children of survivors, have in many ways and in with very various conclusions asked ourselves at different times in life, what would I have done? What would I be like? What would I have done in this situation or that situation? It's inevitable, I think, that question.
Mhm.
And I think in many ways it's a very destructive question because we will never, hopefully, have the possibility of answering it. And it's a situation in which no one knows what one would actually be able to bring up from inside, right? What fortitude or what difficulties. But it's a very big question for children of survivors. It's part of that terrible knowledge that such things can happen, a knowledge that really normally people shouldn't have. And it's part of the questions that we shouldn't have to ask ourselves. What would I
But
have
we do.
done? But we do. But we do. Yes.
Yes.
Well, uh, thank you so much for sharing this amazing journey with us and these amazing stories. I am so grateful to you for the fact that you created them and for the fact that I met you through Sydney and that we had this opportunity to talk about these amazing, amazing women. Thank you, Paula.
And thank you, Irit and Sydney, for making this conversation and the showing of my paintings possible. I really appreciate it. And I welcome any comments and any invitations to show these paintings. So thank you all so much. I'm honored to have participated tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. And
you.
thank you, Sydney. And thank you to the Museum of Jewish Holocaust, a living memorial to the Holocaust. The Jewish, this is such a mouthful. This is such a
I
mouthful.
know, it's a
The
long name.
Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I apologize. Thank you for making this possible. As always, I'm very honored to be part of these programs, Sydney.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here with us this evening and for such an interesting and like I said, really enlightening conversation. And we're getting lots of people in the chat who are echoing that sentiment. So I also want to thank all of our attendees for being with us this evening. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we hope you will consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.